Welcome to the Benzo Free Podcast, your home for an honest, straightforward, and personal discussion about anti-anxiety drugs, their effects, and how to deal with dependence and withdrawal. Whether you have taken benzodiazepines, Z drugs, or any other tranquilizers, know someone who has, or you just want help dealing with chronic anxiety and insomnia, this is your podcast. I'm your host, D.E. Foster, author of the book, Benzo Free, The World of Anti-Anxiety Drugs and the Reality of Withdrawal. I'm so glad you joined us today. Please stick around and let me bend your ear for a few minutes. It just might feel a little better on the other side. Hello there, this is D, and welcome to episode 96 of the Benzo Free Podcast. This is part one of an exciting two-part interview. Our conversation with psychiatrist and benzo advocate Dr. Alexis Ritvo. This is a pretty good one, and I hope you enjoy it. I will have more interviews and roundtables coming up soon too. I'm trying to schedule some out for the first part of 2022. So this is just the beginning. So please pay attention and whatever else I was going to say there. As you can tell, I'm going to leave these things in because I have my script, but still every now and then I don't know how to finish a sentence. And so I will just kind of leave it hanging, which I'm going to do this time, and I'm going to move on. As you know, I do write out my script. As some of you know, some of you, this may be the first episode you're listening to. And you know what? I want to say right now up front, welcome. I hope you enjoy our podcast, and I'm really glad you're joining. If this is the first one you've listened to, so glad to have you here as part of this. If you've been listening for a long time, thank you so much for coming back. I love the fact that I have longtime listeners. Some of you for over a couple of years now have been listening to this podcast. In fact, I think our podcast in March is going to be 3 years old. So we've been doing this for a little while. I've been in a wave lately. Big surprise, as I know many of you have too. And I know these can be really frustrating sometimes. For some of you, I'm sure you don't even have, waves yet. Perhaps your symptoms appear to be constant and never ending. And I understand that. I was at that phase at one time too. I have to admit, I limit what I say about my symptoms sometimes on this podcast, and I believe I've shared that with you before, because I know some of the listeners look at my journey with benzo withdrawal as a sample of what theirs is going to be like. Since I'm 7.5 years off benzos and still have symptoms, that can be anything that can be far from a motivating type of story to share. And I want to make sure that I'm motivating in this podcast and providing hope in this podcast instead of trying to tell people that this is going to be bad. I always want to mention when I talk about my symptoms, my lingering symptoms, that I say, number one, I'm in the minority, and in the very small minority, probably only about 10 to 15% of people who have taken benzos long-term wind up in a protracted withdrawal lasting lengthy like mine is. So it's a small percentage. And also I did some things wrong. I have some extenuating circumstances, as I've shared many times in this podcast. So things happened that also probably have caused my protracted condition. So please don't use my example as a what's the term I'm looking for? Fortune teller. I'm looking for another term for that, as a predictor. There we go. We'll go with predictor, as a predictor of what your experience will be. Because it's not. Everyone is completely different in this, and by far most people will have an easier experience than mine. Unfortunately, some of you have had a harder experience than mine also, and for those, I really feel for you, and I hope this podcast is helping out a little bit. But as I said at the beginning, when I first started this podcast, I will be honest, and this is who I am. So I'm not going to hide what's going on with me, because if I did that, then you wouldn't trust me. Anyway, back to my wave, which is what this was all about. For those of you who have been doing this for a while and have had waves come and go, And like I said before, some of you are in the beginning stages or an acute type of withdrawal, which means you're not having waves. Your symptoms are just consistent and always on. And I know how difficult that can be. But for those of us who get to that roller coaster phase of waves coming and going, and like myself, my waves can be pretty far apart now because I'm in protracted withdrawal, but of course I do still get waves. And I'm often slow to recognize a wave because I have some symptoms that just continue. And they're there with me all the time. They're usually minor, but I do have ones that stick with me. But when some of the older ones creep back in and they kind of build, I often, what's the term I'm looking for? See, I'm having trouble finding terms today. That's another symptom. Is my cognitive abilities. Oh, we all know that, for those of you who've been listening to the podcast, that I leave those in because I know many of you face the same problem. And I figure it's just better for me not to edit out my mistakes and guffaws and all those ums that I do sometimes, although I do sometimes edit out my ums. But but still, it's slow to recognize my waves becoming, because a lot of times I'll just have a symptom or two and I don't always think about it, or I think maybe I'm not feeling well, or maybe I got COVID again, or maybe I'm fighting a cold or just stressed. There's a lot of other instigators of maladies that we face in our life. And so it's hard to know if it's a wave of symptoms. And of course, these can be triggered by so many things. But anyway, I can go on for a while before I realize I'm in a wave, but then eventually it kind of hits me. I think back and then I look at what I've been doing for the past week or two and I think, oh my God, I'm in a wave. I'm just curious if any of you have had that same kind of pattern that I have, but I get that a lot. It makes sense for me because I had a very stressful 2021, as many of you know, and I've shared that along the way, between COVID, work, my family issues, and so many other things going on. And many of you are dealing with those same things. I know I'm not the only one. Also, during that time, I was not taking good care of myself. I put on about 25 pounds. I wasn't exercising enough. I was in the car a lot, driving back and forth between Kansas City and Denver. I was overworked to the degree that I was trying to work on the Benzodiazepine Action Work Group and try to keep up with the podcast and managing my parents. It gets busy, as so many of you who have families and work and outstanding circumstances and other things going on understand. I'm definitely not the only one here. But life makes it difficult for us to find times to take care of ourselves. But I am a true believer in taking that time. If you don't take that time for yourself, if you don't try to stay true to some of the tools that may have gotten you through benzo withdrawal, then unfortunately you will have some difficulties like I have had. And it's so easy to let those tools and practices that may have gotten us through the most difficult times in benzo withdrawal, it's so easy to let those fade and slip because we start feeling better. Well, I don't need those anymore. And you don't think that. It's just you run out of time to do them because now you're feeling good and you're not getting the constant reminders via the pain and aches and symptoms that you need to manage them by doing these tools. And you wind up back, like I have, where I need to reset and restart again. So this year, 2022, new resolution and all, I'm getting back to basics. Better diet, more exercise, even returning to my meditation, maybe even some yoga again. These tools got me through the hardest experiences of my life, those initial years of benzo withdrawal. And when things get tough again, I think I have to go back to basics. You know, as I'm talking to you right now, I'm staring at this circular, round, shiny gold bowl that sits on my desk right now. It sits right on the right side of my desk. This is a Tibetan singing bowl, for those of you who don't know what they are, but it's made out of hard metal. I don't know what metal it is. Is it brass or something? It looks like brass. I don't know. But it's a bowl, and it's built so that it maintains the resonance of whatever sound that it has. I'm familiar with this as being a drummer because I used to have to, evaluate cymbals and different gongs and different chimes and different, metallic objects. Each different had different resonances, and for percussion, we had to work with those. And anyway, this one is amazing, in its resonance. And resonance, of course, meaning it maintains the sound for a long, sustained period of time. Anyway, this was a gift from my best friend, JB. Many of you have heard me talk about him. He's traveled with me. He's been in my life for several decades, and he's just great to have around. I love this thing he got. This Tibetan singing bowl is great, and I love him for giving it to. I mean, that's not why I love him. I love him because he's been my best friend for decades. But this bowl is a reminder of how thoughtful he is, and I just wanted to say a shout out and thanks to JB. He's also one of the truest listeners of this podcast, and as a friend, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to him for listening to the podcast and doing that. And that's, I just hope I give back to him to some degree what he's given to me. Almost every morning, I strike this bowl to start me off on a mindful note. Here, let me strike this for you, and you can kind of hear what I'm talking about. Here, just listen up. I love the resonance of that. Isn't that amazing? In fact, I'm going to replace the bell that I have on doesn't have a D, on my moment of peace during the recording. So I'm going to record this eventually. I just haven't gotten around to it. And this will be our new meditation bell, or meditation bowl, I guess is more appropriate. Meditation sound that we'll have at the end of our podcast for our moment of peace. Our original bell was from a set of concert bells, the glockenspiel, the concert bells that we play in percussion from my days as a percussionist. But this, I think, is a much better sound. This is perfect for meditation, and that resonance is amazing. I also have a candle on my desk that provides some nice calming aromatherapy. I think my one right now is sea salt driftwood, and it's a very nice scent. I love different scents, and those also help to remind me to calm and help provide a calming ambiance when I'm here at my desk. It's the little things like this that can help remind us to get back to our basics, to keep our basics, and keep us taking care of ourselves in the long run. Anyway, I think these are good tools, and I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about some of those this morning. I figured that was a good way to kind of kick this off, but I don't want to take too long because we have an exciting feature. But before I jump into that, though, I do want to mention something on the calendar for me. I have a presentation coming up that I'm providing to a group. I get these periodically, and I do different presentations at different groups. Some are private, some are public. But on February 22nd, I'll be speaking to one of the support groups at Benzo Warrior. Benzo Warrior is a great organization. They've been doing support for those people in the Benzo community for a long time. You can find them on Facebook under Benzo Warrior Group or on their website at benzowarrior.com. This community has over 2,100 members and provides a wide variety of resources, so please go check them out. I'll leave a link for this in our show notes. Anyway, I'm going to be speaking at one of their support group meetings on the 22nd of February. It is limited to group members, so you can't just pop in and say hi. But if you're wanting to join their group, please check them out and let them know. I think there's a process you go through for becoming a member. But if you're interested, please learn more and see if this is for you. Anyway, I'm going to be speaking on a topic. This one is going to be on, I believe, kind of life after benzos. So returning to some semblance of quote unquote a normal life. How do you get back to life, even if you still have symptoms or protracted complications or other complications of loss of job, loss of relationship, whatever going on? How do we get back to normal? How do we get back to a fulfilling life or even a new life? I'm looking forward to it. And our format today's episode is our introduction, which you just heard, and part one of our conversation with Dr. Alexis Ritvo. Since we have this two-part interview and there's a lot to this interview, we don't really have time for other sections on these two episodes. So it'll just be introductions and we'll go right into the interview. So stand by for that. But before we do, one last thing. As you always know, don't forget, I'd love to hear from you. Comment on our videos on YouTube, on our podcast posts, or via our feedback form on our website at easinganxiety.com/feedback. And while you're there, perhaps you might want to subscribe to our mailing list or even donate to support the work we do. Every little bit helps. I do greatly appreciate that. And remember, the Benzo Free Podcast is for informational purposes only and should never be considered medical advice. Our feature today is part one of our conversation with Dr. Alexis Ritvo. In the first part of this interview, we discuss benzo organizations, legislation, advocacy, prescriber education, so much more. Our focus on this first part is primarily on benzo advocacy and awareness. In part two of our interview, which is in our next episode, we dive much deeper into the individual struggles of the patient on finding a doctor, tips for handling withdrawal, polydrugging, and much more. So please remember to listen to part two of this conversation in episode 97. I'll put a link to it in our show notes. Also, I attempted to put links to most of the resources mentioned in my conversation with Dr. Ritvo in our show notes also. So please check those out if you'd like to seek out more information from those resources. Alexis, I'm calling her Alexis because she said it was okay. Actually, I've worked with her for a long time now. She's a colleague of mine and a friend. And as a fellow co-chair, she's actually my fellow co-chair of the Benzodiazepine Action Work Group. I'm in meetings with her 2 to 3 times a week, and I just have to say she's amazing. I'm so happy to have her on this podcast, and I thank her for her dedication to this cause and for taking the time to speak to us here. You know, before we dive into that conversation, let me share a little bit about her. Alexis Ritvo, MD, MPH, serves as Medical Director of the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices, and she is also co-chair for the Benzodiazepine Action Work Group at the Colorado Consortium for Prescription Drug Abuse Prevention. She is a board-certified addiction psychiatrist and assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. She has been the program director. Backing up. Blah, blah, blah. She has been the program director for the CU Addiction Psychiatry Fellowship since July of 2020. Dr. Ritvo has a passion for psychotherapy, teaching, and improving health systems and policies. Now, I can go on and on with her credentials because they run a whole page of paper, but I'd rather let Dr. Ritvo tell you more about her background. So let's join the conversation. All right, I want to welcome to the podcast Dr. Alexis Ritvo. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. I was wondering if maybe we could start off with a little bit about your background, your medical background, what got you into psychiatry, and then we'll move into benzos after that. Let's just start out with your general background, if that's okay.
Sure. So I am a board certified addiction psychiatrist. So after completing medical school, which I went to Emory University in Atlanta, and actually also did a master's in public health and health policy there. I then came back to Colorado, where I'm a proud native, and did my general psychiatry residency. Finished that in June of 2016, and then I did a 1-year fellowship in addiction psychiatry and finished that June of 2017, and came onto faculty at the University of Colorado School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. And starting in July 2020, became our addiction psychiatry fellowship director.
Oh, that's great. Tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, family, anything you're wanting to share, anything like that?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, as a good proud native, I always have to mention as many times as you can that I'm proudly born and raised in Colorado. I am actually the child of 2 psychiatrists, but also one of multi-generational psychiatrists. So depending on one's views of psychiatry, it's either a calling or a disease. I've been told I'm a congenital psychiatrist by an OB when I was a medical student. So my parents, my father, Dr. Jonathan Ritvo, is from the East Coast. So he was born in New York City, raised in Connecticut, and went to school and did all his medical school and internship out there, and then came out west. And like many, fell in love with the outdoors and the mountains, and the kind of work hard, play hard attitude. And then my mom, Joanne Ritvo, was born in Minnesota and raised in all over Montana, and then came to medicine actually later, after doing work in professional writing, and also found her way to psychiatry. And so they met in their psychiatry residency in Colorado. Yeah, and then my father's actually not only a psychiatrist, but addiction psychiatry. So he was in the group that kind of founded addiction psychiatry as a subspecialty.
Oh, wow.
And back in, I think it was 1997, around when it finally became a board certified specialty. And he was the first addiction psychiatry fellowship director here in Colorado. Um, and he's still working, and he's one of our supervisors at one of the sites for our fellows. So it's pretty fun to get to collaborate with him. So
Oh,
um,
great.
I don't come by this as an original idea.
No, it's nice to have some of those running in the family like that. Since this is the Benzo Free podcast, we might as well move on to that topic a little bit, and that's what we'll be talking about most of the time, today's conversation. I'd like to start out with, where did you first become interested in complications related to benzodiazepines? I know right now you focus a lot on benzodiazepines. So where did that shift come, or was it a shift, or how did that happen?
Yeah. So yeah, I think as an addiction psychiatrist, you're studying a lot about physical dependence, tolerance, and then as well the other sequelae that come with addiction. And you find that many other psychiatrists and physicians aren't as comfortable with those issues and with a lot of the uncertainty that comes with dealing with physical dependence and withdrawal. And so increasingly I was originally working in outpatient addiction treatment center, and then the patients that would come into the residential center and then transfer or transition, I should say, to the outpatient, would have patients that were on benzodiazepines, often prescribed. Some of them that did have a use disorder, but the vast majority where they had actually taken them as prescribed, and then trying to get them off of them was very challenging. And then I should say the other part of my time, I get to supervise general psychiatry residents in a general outpatient psychiatry clinic. And so on that side, we get referred a lot of patients that come from primary care or from other mental health prescribers. Many who have been on these benzos chronically, even though that's not the indication for them, and who some recognize that they're having issues because of the long-term benzo use. Others aren't aware that maybe some of the difficulties they're having with concentration, memory, could be related to the benzos, or even rebound anxiety. And so then working with those patients to try to see if they have interest, motivation to try to taper, and fumbling along the way, but trying to learn how to approach it in a way that you get the patient on the same team with you and figure out how to try to minimize their symptoms. So that's kind of how I became interested. And then I guess it was about 2 years ago, ended up on a phone call. I can't remember if, I think you might have been there. I know some of our other cohort was, with the Department of Public Health and Education,
Yeah.
about the
Yeah, I remember that
concerns
one.
with benzos and suicide, prescribed
Mhm.
benzos and suicide, and kind of things just took off from there as far as gathering a group of us from Colorado that were interested in the issue.
That's actually a perfect segue. I was going to move to that topic next. There's
Yeah.
two organizations that you're involved with, I know, within benzodiazepines. I'd like to first start out with the one that you and I are both involved in.
Yeah.
As you just mentioned, the kind of grassroots and how this got started. You are my fellow co-chair, so we're both co-chairs for the Benzodiazepine Action Work Group within the Colorado Consortium for Prescription Drug Abuse Prevention. And so, and you are one of the original founders, and founded with Dr. Stephen Wright, and he was the original co-chair. I replaced him last year about this time, when he retired, as we know.
Right.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the group, since we can both talk to this, but this is your interview, so I want you to do more of the talking, if that's okay. But talk a little bit about what we do at Benzodiazepine Action Work Group, and then we can move into some of the projects we've been working on. But maybe we can start overall with just, how did this group get started? You mentioned a little bit of the background. Who are the members from? Where did you collect the members from? How did you get them interested in getting this going?
Yeah. So, yeah, so I mentioned the initial meeting, which I think was December 2019, if my
Yeah,
recollection
I think
serves
so.
me right, pre-pandemic. Um, and then from there, our Department of Psychiatry at the University of Colorado School of Medicine does an annual um, lecture about suicide prevention. And so in May of 2020, it was about benzodiazepines and suicide. And with one of my mentors, the one that actually organizes that lecture, Dr. Michael Allen, with his support, he allowed us to convene a group that after the actual grand rounds that was presented met as a group of stakeholders interested in the issue of benzodiazepine safe prescribing and
Mhm.
deprescribing. And so that kind of started the initial conversation. Had kind of anyone, whether medical provider, individuals from the public, affected individuals, public health professionals, join an initial meeting that same day after the grand rounds and talk about various interests and ways to approach it. From there, I can't remember when we next met, probably a few months down the line. I think it was like
It's
July.
it's
And then,
pretty it's pretty fuzzy in my brain. I know I
yeah,
was kinda
right.
hoping you would
We
have
were
better
in
memory on
the
this
midst of
than
the
me.
pandemic. Uh, And then I was aware of the Colorado Consortium for Prescription Drug Abuse because of my work in addiction and because they're connected with our school pharmacy,
Right.
and knew that they had done a lot of really great work and gotten good funding for things like provider education. A big focus, their main focus started with prescription opioids and the resulting opioid epidemic. And they had created these really successful work groups, both educating providers, affected friends and family, harm reduction, especially getting naloxone to patients, all sorts of things with the prescription drug monitor, to name a few. And they had these work groups, and I'd been kind of peripherally involved. And so the group of us that were meeting in this stakeholders group kind of took a vote and agreed that we were interested in approaching the consortium to see if they'd be willing to take us on as an additional work group under their kind of scaffolding because of the strong connection they have with the state legislature and getting funding and connections across the state. And it seemed like a really good way. I think the biggest reluctance we all had was that their name includes prescription drug abuse, and that an important part of our message is that the vast majority of individuals that suffer from injury from
Mhm.
benzodiazepines are taking them as prescribed,
Right.
and do not meet criteria for a use disorder or abuse of their prescription. But we decided that that was not a big enough, that alone was not a reason to not join the consortium. So that's how we came to.
Yeah. Yeah, that was yeah, a lot of it's funny when we go back that far to remember all the things that have happened over time to get us to this point.
Mhm.
Let's talk about the focus of it now. I know we have several
Yeah.
projects we're working on, and a few I wanted to touch on with you. Let's start off with the guidance documents. There were some subgroups, and we worked on some documentation. Can you kind of talk a little bit about how that happened and where those are, and are those available to the public? I mean, I know the answer to this, but I'm
Yes.
asking you.
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, one of the initial goals in the group was to create some sort of deliverable that we could share with the public via the internet. So, I mean, while our focus remains helping Colorado, since that's where we live, that would be available to all. And so we kind of realized there were kind of three subgroups that we wanted to focus on initially. So one was creating a safe prescribing guidance that
Mhm.
would be no more than 2 pages plus references, a safe deprescribing or tapering guidance, again, no more than 2 pages and then references, and then also peer support, which has been
Right.
um, uh, really lacking in this community for individuals that are struggling and suffering from issues with prescribed benzodiazepines and tapering them. And so we just kind of had people break up into the groups. People reviewed the guidance documents across them. Dr. Stephen Wright, of course, who has
Hmm.
a walking encyclopedic memory of all references related to benzodiazepine, was vital in both of the prescribing and deprescribing documents. And those are now posted on our work group page for the Colorado Consortium for Prescription Drug
Right.
Abuse. So if you go there and you go to the Benzo Action Work Group, they're at the bottom of the page. We're updating them to include that we did them with the support and agreement of our partner organizations. So I believe
Right.
your podcast, as well as the Benzo Information Coalition and the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices, and then the Schreiber Research Group are kind of all groups that have had members that have been very involved with our work group.
Oh, great. And actually, that's at the website for that, just so people know, is corxconsortium.org. And as Alexis mentioned, if you go there, click on work groups, you'll see benzodiazepine action, and that'll take you to the page for that. Let's talk about a couple more. One is, of course, prescriber education. This is one I know that you've been spearheading. And this is a critical one because so often on the podcast, we get I got to say complaints, but it's the feedback about doctors not finding a doctor who can help, not finding a doctor who's educated, or even that their psychiatrist or GP wants them to stay on the drug and doesn't even know that there's a problem with these long term.
Mhm.
You're working on some prescriber education. Explain to us a little bit how that might help and what you're doing and what kind of progress going forward on that.
Yeah. So we as a common refrain today is you and I, along with this other kind of sub uh, core group, um, started with actually testifying in front of the state legislature for House Bill
Right.
1276, which was largely for substance use disorders, but included some really important components that affect benzodiazepine prescribing. And so the two things in that bill that got passed, one was a new requirement that prescribers limit the amount of benzodiazepines they're prescribing initially. So if a patient has not had a benzodiazepine in the last 12 months, that the initial script is limited. Um, I,
Right.
I keep going back to see what the final rules ended up being, and it's hard to make. They were kind of going back and forth
Yeah,
about
yeah. I have to keep reminding myself. I'm confused on it every time I look at
to
it.
say. I don't remember if we wanted it to be a week. I think it's either 2 weeks, it might be four.
Yeah.
But the idea being trying to limit so that people aren't initially on more than the indicated 2 to 4 weeks, but at the same time being really careful to make sure that it said any prescriber and it didn't have to be the same prescriber, so that you didn't have patients that had been on these medications, say starting with a new prescriber and suddenly being not able to continue, and
Right.
say ending up with acute withdrawal. So that was a big part, was getting that requirement. And then the other was that the law included funding for additional prescriber education, both for opioids, prescribing opioids, as well as for prescribing benzodiazepines. And so with that funding and with the support of the provider education work group, we're developing what we think will probably be a four week lunch and learn series about safe prescribing of benzodiazepines. I think we're estimating that we'll do it in May. And so those will be live, or
Yeah.
virtually live, lunchtime events, for any prescribers, free, that count as continuing medical education. And then they'll be recorded so that we can then post them and make them available to the public. And then we'll also use the funding to make sure we do a good kind of uh, campaign to make sure that especially prescribers across the state of Colorado are aware of this free resource for education about safe prescribing of benzodiazepines. Another unique part that we're trying to add to it is hopefully start each of the presentations with a brief presentation, to be redundant, but from a benzo survivor, that talking about their
Right.
own experience with benzo. I mean, I think that's something that is really powerful. I mean, whether it's, I mean,
Yeah.
this is how laws get passed, right? It's the stories, not the numbers. And I
Right.
think for providers, many of them aren't like, if they don't know about this, or if they haven't been open to it, they're not the ones
Hmm.
necessarily continuing to see these patients once they're already affected. Um,
Right.
Instead, I mean, because this is an area of interest for me, because I have addiction background dealing, so managing withdrawal, I mean, patients get referred to me, and
Hmm.
um, and I end up seeing them. So I think the lived experience is really important for prescribers to really hear, this estimated 10 to 15%, although maybe even higher, of individuals that really suffer from long-term use of benzodiazepines and trying to
Right.
come off of them.
Yeah, it's an ongoing problem, and I love the fact that you're trying to include the lived experience. And I remember back to when you and we were working with Dr. Stephen Wright and stuff, and getting some of this set up. One of the key things he mentioned that I thought was really valuable, he says it was the personal stories he saw at TIBS, at the International Benzodiazepine Symposium, that really helped to change his prescribing practices and change his
Mhm.
opinion about benzodiazepines. And I'm glad to see that, at least the medical professionals are realizing those stories are important, and that's a factor that we need to include with that. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk about one other project here before we move on to a different group, and that is the benzodiazepine peer support training program that we have been working on. And this is one of those things that we got some funding for. And can you just talk a little bit about this? I know I can too, but this isn't about me, so I want you to kind of be the one
Yeah.
who can speak to this program.
Right. I'm more the support, I guess, the medical provider support for this one, but still, like, so excited and proud to be associated with it. So, like we said, there's this huge lack of support for individuals that are dealing with injury from benzodiazepines. So, yeah, so we recognize there's a great need for an evidence-based, effective kind of program that would provide peer support for individuals suffering from injury from benzodiazepines. So we had an opportunity to apply for some funding to speak to some experts in the field of, let's see, peer recovery coaching and peer, in
Mhm.
Colorado, they're kind of under the same umbrella, and peer support, which are traditionally peers providing services either in for mental health as well as for um, substance use disorders, which is, I always have to say, also a mental health issue, but separated.
Yes.
And so we looked into kind of what the requirements are in Colorado for getting that certification, and then outreached some individuals that have run and developed some of these curriculums that meet those criteria. And so we contacted them and kind of created a core group. And our goal is to create so the peer support, peer recovery coaching requirements. There's kind of a core curriculum that everyone has to take to get that certification. And
Right.
then there's another set of hours of didactics that's required, but it's not, um, there's not predetermined exactly what you have to take. It just has to fall within certain categories. Yeah, so our goal is to create this series of materials, didactic materials that would meet that kind of elective time and that would be focused on providing peer support for individuals um, suffering from benzodiazepine injury.
Great. Yeah, it's been pretty exciting. I know we got the funding through ARPA, which is a federal grant, and came through the consortium, and we're just working out the details. I just want to also mention the Schreiber Research Group is a major player in this, and Terry Schreiber and her organization will be managing the funds and trying to spearhead that piece of it. And I want to say how much I appreciate that, and also want to appreciation to especially to Jose and to Gina at the consortium and for all their support in getting the funding for this program to get kicking off. So that's been fantastic, and I think we have a lot of potential here for creating. The thing I'm most excited about is these are the classes that people normally take for, as you know, for addiction, recovery coaches, and for people dealing with substance abuse issues. And so we're actually going to offer a program to them that will also include benzodiazepines, so they'll understand the differences and how people suffering from dependence to benzos might differ from some of the other substances.
Yeah. And I think I mean, I will say increasingly within the world of addiction, there's also more and more um, issues with benzodiazepine use disorder. So
Yeah,
there'll be an interesting kind of overlap or Venn diagram. Like I said, we know the majority of people that take prescription benzos are taking them as prescribed, that develop these issues. And then I think within the world of addiction, there's a mix of individuals taking them
sure.
as prescribed and then some that do develop a use disorder, plus a whole nother realm of these designer benzodiazepines that people that are not prescription buying online. But I think the material we provide will be helpful with all of that,
Right.
for individuals that are working within the addiction community.
Great. I'll close out here the Benzodiazepine Action Work Group a little bit, and we'll move on to another organization you're working with. Before I do, just real quick, for those who want more information, you can go to corxconsortium.org, click on work groups, and you can go down to Benzodiazepine Action to learn more and see some of those documents that Alexis was referring to. So please go check that out. Let's move on to another organization, and this is the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices. I want to say congratulations to you officially here on being the new medical director for this organization.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Can you tell me a little bit about your role and how this came to you and how this all happened?
Yeah, so the former medical director was Dr. Stephen Wright. Clearly, he has been very involved in kind of a founding medical person in trying to change the tide here. And he was retiring, and I had been come on as an advisor with the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices, and was asked to start to interview some of the um, physicians that were applying to be medical director. And so I did several interviews and met some really interesting people, almost all of them with some sort of addiction specialty background, whether addiction medicine or addiction psychiatry. However, I realized while I still feel like there's so much I don't know about this, that I had even in my, year and a half, I guess, of doing this work, I had more experience and knowledge than many of them did because they were not yet working in this sphere. And kind of the stars aligned, and I was able to figure out carving out some time in
Mhm.
my work with the Department of Psychiatry to be able to be contracted,
Right.
basically as a consultant medical director for the Alliance. And so in that role, kind of serve as, reviewing um, a lot of the work they're doing as far as writing papers, collaborating with the FDA on the safe use initiative, trying to develop um, an echo model for providing education to prescribers that are seeing patients struggling with issues with prescribed benzodiazepines, and so it just kind of fell together. So that just
That's
started.
great. So, could you elaborate on some of those projects that the Alliance is working on? I know some of them. I'm part with a couple of them, but there's so many other things going on that I don't even know about. So, could you maybe just talk through
Yeah,
a few of them?
I mean, and I still feel like I'm still learning because the executive director Bernie Silvernail and then Doreen Shervin, who
Right.
I know she has a public health background. I can't, on the tip of my tongue, I can't think of her exact title in the alliance. But they have done a remarkable job. The alliance is very focused on the issue of safe prescribing,
Right.
um, and they were instrumental in getting the FDA to revise the black box warning on benzodiazepines so that in September 2020 it was updated to include that uh, taking prescribed benzodiazepines has this risk of physical dependence, especially when taken
Right.
beyond 2 to 4 weeks, as well as subsequently issues with withdrawal and potentially even protracted withdrawal, or they don't use in the black box warning the word injury, but some um,
Mhm.
really long-standing persistent symptoms after taking them. And so that was a huge accomplishment to get that done. But now the next step, sadly, I'm constantly reminded that actually many prescribers aren't aware of that black box warning or what it added. And so I think, figuring out what else we need to do. So I know they have been working with the FDA on a continued safe use initiative. So again, how do we make sure that benzodiazepines are used and prescribed safely?
Hmm.
Um, safe prescribing. And then other things, I mean, we're on a group that's looking at writing a paper that really, which has been quite an interesting process, trying to decide what should the agreed upon term
Term.
be
Yeah.
for what is referred to, as you've heard me say, various, as either protracted withdrawal, post-acute withdrawal,
Yeah,
benzodiazepine
this
injury.
has been a fun process. I have to admit,
Yeah,
I'm on the same team, and it's been a fun process trying to figure out the basically how do we name this thing? What do we call this thing that we call so
yeah.
many different things? Like you said, benzodiazepine withdrawal syndrome, protracted withdrawal, benzo injury syndrome. There's so many terms out there.
Yeah, neurological disorder, dysfunction,
Right.
neuropsychiatric, neurocognitive.
Toxicity. Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
Um, so that's another, big one that's on the in process,
Right.
and has been really interesting because it's really, I mean, I think what I've enjoyed so much about this work is, I think to be effective, I mean, you have to have this multidisciplinary group that is not just, in the vacuum of medical providers,
Yeah.
or one specialty. So we really have a whole array of folks from, addiction psychiatrist, addiction medicine, um, affected individuals, public
Hmm.
health, folks with public health, a lot of overlap. I mean, actually, I know within each of those categories, we have we have at least one individual that is an affected individual, and um, some of those other
Right.
uh,
Right.
roles. Um,
And actually, that same setup is what I really enjoy about all these. If I had to include like the three organizations, our work group, the Benzodiazepine Action Work Group, along with the Alliance for blah, blah. Let's try that again. Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices, and of course, Benzodiazepine Information Coalition. All of them do seem to be, like you mentioned, that blend of medical professionals and lived experience. And I do think that's one of the reasons why these three groups have had some of the most best progress, at least I believe, in the last few years, as far as making a change for benzodiazepines and treatment of people suffering from benzodiazepines.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I've been really impressed in the alliance, which has more of a focus on prescribers, although does have some tools and other things
Right.
oriented towards patients, and has collaborated with, as you've mentioned, these three groups have all collaborated and have a lot of overlapping uh, members. Um, the alliance has he's actually Bernie Silvernail has recruited individuals from across the globe.
Yeah. That website, just so everybody knows, is at benzoreform.org for the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices. Please go check out their website. There's so much information there. Check out the people check out the About Us page, learn about the people who are working there and the progress they made. It's an excellent resource if you haven't checked that out, so please do so. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I noticed that while I listen to myself and I edit myself when I'm doing interviews, I talk a lot faster than when I'm just talking one-on-one to the mic here to you. I want to thank you to Dr. Ritvo for taking the time to speak to us. Please don't forget to listen to part 2 of this interview on episode 97 of the podcast, which was released on the same day as this one. Of course, there is a link, blah, 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 one more time. There is a link for this episode in our show notes. And before I close, please allow me 25 seconds for our disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice in any way. The host of this podcast is not a medical professional, nor is he engaged in rendering medical, health, or psychological advice, nor any other kind of personal or professional services. The views and opinions expressed by our listeners and interview guests on this podcast, whether read from textual submissions or presented in their own voice, do not necessarily reflect those of the Benzo Free podcast or of its host. Withdrawal tapering or any other change in dosage of benzodiazepines, non-benzodiazepines, or any other prescription drug should only be done under the direct supervision of a licensed physician. Our full disclaimer can be viewed on our website at benzofree.org/disclaimer. Thank you again for joining me, and please remember to check out part 2 of this conversation. Keep calm, taper slowly, and take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.